Right, I'm going to kick us off. I'll start by acknowledging that I'm joining you all from the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people here in Canberra, um, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and also, of course, acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands that many of you will be joining us on in Kooyong. So thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you especially to Dr. Monique Ryan for making herself available for today's important webinar. So everybody who's joining us here today knows that we all need a stable home to be able to retreat to. And for so many of us, that's the invisible foundation that we build our lives on. And everybody who's here with us today, I think also knows that Australia is in the midst of a housing crisis that's locking more and more people out of the dream of having a secure home. And instead of being our invisible foundation and our sanctuary, housing is becoming a huge cause of stress and anxiety for a lot of people and the driver for a lot of inequality across the country. That's why organisations on the front lines of the crisis came together to form Everybody's Home in 2018. Everybody's Home is a national campaign to fix Australia's housing crisis, and it's made up of a coalition of housing, homelessness and welfare organisations. And it's also made up of over 40,000 average Australians who have signed up to the campaign because they want to see change. So for those who don't know me, and I imagine that'll be many of you, my name is Maiy Azize. I'm the national spokesperson for the Everybody's Home campaign, and I'm also the Deputy CEO of Anglicare Australia in my day job. And this is the second of our election online town halls. We had a great session last week with Jerome Laxale from Bennelong, and we've got another one coming up for the seat of Brisbane. We're also planning to do a WA town hall as well before everybody votes in the federal election. So how this will work is I'll introduce our great panelists, Lucas and Dr. Monique Ryan. I'll ask a few questions our campaign has put together, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. To ask a question, please put your question in the chat. We'll monitor it and we'll answer as many of them as we can. Do not, this is not one of those webinars where folks raise their hands. So just pop your question in the chat, and that's the easiest way for us to get to you. So we're going to start off with a little bit of scene setting about what some of the things are on the ground in Kooyong, but also just across Victoria. And to do that, we're going to start off with Lucas Testro. Lucas is the Acting Deputy CEO and the Director of Policy and Communications at the Council to Homeless Persons, which is Victoria's peak body representing organisations working to end homelessness. Lucas has more than 20 years' experience as a strategic storyteller, a media producer and a creative leader working in film and television. And he's passionate about developing creative projects that spark social change. So I'm going to hand over to Lucas. And Lucas, can you tell us a little bit about what CHP and some of your member organisations are seeing on the ground when it comes to housing stress, rental stress and homelessness?
Yeah, sure, Maiy. Thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for joining. I'll just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land I'm coming to you from. I'm on Wurundjeri country today and pay my respects to elders past and present. As Maiy said, I'm from Council to Homeless Persons, so we're focusing on really the kind of sharpest end of the housing crisis at the moment, which is homelessness. And I think the main thing I hope everybody could leave today knowing is that it is possible to end homelessness. So governments will say that they have already made significant investment in homelessness responses, and that is true, particularly in Victoria. We've had some very major investments over the last past few years. But at the same time, you will be seeing as you're walking around the streets, and if you follow, what Council of Homeless Persons is saying in the news, that we're experiencing a homelessness crisis, worse than anything we've ever known. The number of people coming to Victorian homelessness services is sitting persistently above 100,000. We've seen like a 23% increase over the past 5 years of Victorians who are employed coming to homelessness services needing assistance. Having a job is no longer protecting people from the risk of homelessness because of the rental crisis and the cost of living crisis. and we're seeing blowouts in the length of our social housing waiting lists. But none of that is happening because homelessness isn't solvable. It's happening because we're coming off the decades of neglect by multiple governments. So, this investment is great, but it's kind of the first drop in the bucket. It's kind of like we're starting 200 meters behind the starting blocks, trying to catch a moving train, right? So the answer is not that we give up. The answer isn't that we sit on our laurels and say we've made great investments. The answer is we've got to run harder and hopefully invest in a really fast car so that we can catch that train. Because the thing is that we know how to end homelessness. It's not a mystery. We need to be building more social homes. We need to be making them an integral and respected part of our housing mix like they once were. We need to be investing more in prevention. It is incredibly effective. We'll probably talk about this a bit later, but our homelessness statistics show Productivity Commission report just this month, earlier this month, and a report by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare at the end of last year showed in 80 to 90% of cases, if people are coming to homelessness services at risk of homelessness, we're able to keep them in their homes. So it's incredibly effective, but it's also really cost effective. It's far more affordable to keep somebody in a tenancy than to have them go into the homelessness system and us have to support them through there, let alone saving hundreds of thousands of people around Australia from unimaginable trauma. And then the third thing is that we need to be investing more in our homelessness response in a practice called Housing First. That's a particular form of response to help long-term people experiencing long-term homelessness secure housing. It's best practice around the world. And briefly, it's just about you start off by putting those people into a stable home, and then you provide supports wrapping around them. And we had a world-leading program for that here in Victoria. It was called From Homelessness to a Home. It had a 95% success rate in helping people secure long-term housing. And we Victoria wound that program back in 2024. So rather than scaling those things down, we need to be investing more in those things. We're seeing in poll after poll that people are calling for action. They're wanting action on housing affordability. They're wanting action to end homelessness. And I think that's because as we're seeing more employed people experiencing that risk of homelessness, as we're seeing the risk of homelessness creeping into areas of society we've never seen before, I think the public is starting to realise and understand that homelessness is not a failure of people. Homelessness is a failure of systems. Homelessness is a choice that we make as a society, and as a society, we can choose to end it too. But to do that, we all have to stand up as a community and hold our governments to account.
Thank you so much for that, Lucas. I think that's a really great introduction, a really great start to the conversation we're having today. To add to some of what you've said, our campaign last week released some polling that we conducted in the seat of Kooyong and a couple of other key seats around the country. And one of the things we found is that housing is the biggest cost of living issue facing most people in the electorate of Kooyong, which wouldn't come as a surprise. It's the case across the country. And we also found that people overwhelmingly favour investment in social housing, which was one of the solutions that you talked about as their preferred solution, preferring it over tax breaks for investors in property. So that's, I think, something that might come as a surprise to a couple of people. So I'm now going to hand over to Dr. Monique Ryan, who you all know is the independent MP for the seat of Kooyong. Monique studied medicine at the University of Melbourne and trained as a paediatric neurologist at Boston Children's Hospital. Before her election as the member for Kooyong, Monique was the director of the neurology department at the Royal Children's Hospital. And since her election, Monique has championed many issues, including health, but also climate, integrity in politics, and tackling the cost of living crisis, which, as we just said, housing is probably the biggest component of that for most people. So Monique, I'm interested in hearing from you about what you're hearing from your constituents, but also what are your preferred approaches to addressing the housing crisis based on the time that you've spent in Parliament so far?
Thank you, and thank you all for the opportunity to be with you today. And I am, like Lucas, on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects as well to the elders past, present and emerging, and to in Indigenous people on this meeting today. Look, it's been a great privilege to be the member for Kooyong for the last 3 years, and one of the fascinating parts of it has been the extent to which housing has become such a front of mind issue for so many people in the community. It really wasn't something that was front of mind at the last federal election, but it clearly is something which is really one of the major talking points, major issues for people 3 years later. And there's a number of reasons for that. Speaking to what Lucas was saying about homelessness and people who are on the verge of homelessness, we've certainly seen a significant uptick of people in that situation in the communities that I represent in the last 3 years. And that's been something that I think has taken people by surprise. I think to some extent, once the government pulled the pin on the support measures that we saw during COVID, a lot of people who'd been very marginal, who'd been sort of really struggling, were rendered homeless, and that's people often say, "Oh, Kooyong's a really wealthy part of the world. It's all leafy green suburbs of rich people, and there's no dramas there." But in fact, that's very clearly not the case, and we have a significant proportion of people who are either homeless or on the verge of homelessness, and we have a very significant number of people who are in housing, either mortgage or rental stress as well. And so I'm hearing about that every day. I'm hearing from young people who have boomeranged back into the family home because they can't afford to rent, and in many cases that's a cause of significant stress for them and for their parents. They can't see how they're ever going to be able to afford a home of their own, particularly in a suburb in which they, the places where they'd like to live, which, as is the case for all of us, is somewhere that's relatively close to your workplace and to your friends and family, essentially. And people, I actually held a housing forum in my electorate office on Friday with Claire O'Neill, the housing minister. We had some young people in, and they all said, look, either we can, if we want to buy a home of our own, the only choice that we have is an apartment or a house right on the periphery, or to go rural. We just can't see how we can ever buy a house in that, inner-ish suburbs of the major cities in our lifetimes without significant policy change. So there's that. But then there's also obviously people talking about difficulties with rental accommodation, significant increases in their rent at the end of the term, people breaking the lease, and just the conditions with the rental standards not being adhered to, and the fact that they are in a situation where they can't really fight too hard because they're terrified that they might lose their rental and have to move at short notice if they push back too hard on inadequate maintenance and care facilities. So I think we're hearing the same thing as pretty much every other electorate in Australia, as far as I can determine. I mean, the exact challenges vary a bit, I think, from one part of a city to another and from rural to regional settings, obviously, but it's the same problems, and everyone's feeling the same stress. And, the recent change in interest rates might help a tiny bit with all of that, but really there's lots of things that can be done. So in terms of, what I'm thinking we can do, there's lots of pieces to this puzzle, and there's lots of areas where both the federal and state governments and local governments can have an impact. The things that I've talked about, I really think that in terms of this, the people who are wanting to buy a home in this country and coming up against the reality of extreme cost of housing and the extent to which it's increased in the last 25 years, we're going to have to look at tax reform. There's just no way that we can address intergenerational inequity without it. It has to be done in an evidence-based and sensitive way so that people, retired people aren't massively disadvantaged by it, but we have to do it so that housing becomes something which all Australians can look forward to potentially owning in their lifetimes again, because we've gotten a bit beyond that, unfortunately, in the last 3 decades. So it's tax reform. I think we still need to look at other levers that we can pull. In every suburb of Kooyong, there's about 10% of homes are empty, and there's stuff that we can do to help with that. we can help people downsize by removing some of the disincentives from it. I think we do need to look at things like rules around Airbnb and the like, particularly in inner city settings. So out of the outer city centres, so you can leave it for those places where people are going there for tourism, but in other parts of the world, it's not working necessarily as well as it could. But we also need to look and work as best we can with state governments. The Victorian state government it's been very difficult to work with them on their activity centre plans because they seem to govern by press release. There's not a lot of detail in what they plan, and they keep changing the goalposts in a way that's really discombobulating to people. I actually think densification of the inner suburbs is a good way to go, but it needs to be done in a way that's sensitive and takes into account communities' concerns about it, and provides the necessary infrastructure as we go, not after the fact. For renters, we need to improve rental protections, and there's various ways that the federal government has tried to do that, but I think there's more that can be done. One of them is just about the government, and I think the opposition will both be coming up with plans to help subsidise electrification of homes, and I think they'll probably be doing that in the next 8 weeks as part of their policies for the federal election. But things around energy efficiency, which is the best way to decrease our emissions, is to not emit. So energy efficiency measures that can help people insulate their homes, make them more energy efficient. We need to make sure that those measures are available to people who are in rental homes. So we need to put in place measures that will carrot and stick measures that will induce landlords to engage with those sorts of things. There's ways that we can do that. So long answer to a short question, but I think there's, and I also think that we need to increase support payments, both the Commonwealth rental assistance payment, but also job seeker and other support payments for those people who are most vulnerable and struggling most with the cost of rentals and housing. So they're all things I've been talking to people about, hearing about, and trying to talk to the government about.
Thanks so much for that. Very comprehensive look into some of your thinking, and a lot of that's really music to my ears. We'll come back to a few of those elements a bit later, but I did want to start off with a question for you about Labor and Liberals' flagship policies. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get either Labor or Liberal representatives to come to this town hall, which was a real shame. But in 2023, Parliament passed Labor's flagship housing policy, which was the Housing Australia Future Fund, which has a target to build 30,000, or I should say 40,000 social and affordable homes over the next 5 years, and also passed a Help to Buy scheme last year. The Liberals are saying they will scrap the Housing Australia Future Fund, and their flagship policy is super for housing, allowing people to dip into their superannuation savings for a house deposit. Do you have any reflections on those approaches? Do you see any problems with them? And how do you think that you can use your position in Parliament to put some pressure on the major parties to do a bit more?
Thank you. I do have some opinions about those. Well, I talk about these all the time. So in terms of the Labor Party policies, the Housing Australia Future Fund, I've said this to the Minister herself 3 days ago, I thought that it should have been twice as big as it is. I don't think it has. It's okay. It's good. It'll build some social housing, and it will increase the government's commitment to housing. But I really feel that the federal government needs to step up into this space, and I would have doubled it. When it was passed, I would have doubled the size of it and really pushed to build as many houses as possible, particularly social housing. And I think actually that maybe the federal government should step back into this space itself, and rather than leaving it to developers and to second parties, to actually take on the task, which it has done in the past in crisis times, of building that housing itself and looking at different and innovative ways of doing that. I've been talking to people who can put up a prefab house in three days, literally, and if we find the sites for those sorts of things and the federal government actually bit the bullet and ran them themselves, we could do it at less profit and more quickly than the developers necessarily can. Now, it's not going to be an answer for everybody, but it will be the answer for some people, and it could take could really lessen the strain on people who are the most vulnerable. You know, we have a situation where the federal and state governments are at odds with each other at times. You know, Dan Andrews is wanting to pull down big housing towers, but we don't have an immediate target, a way of replacing that housing. And so that for mine is problematic. Same with the Help to Buy scheme. You know, I thought it was okay. It was fine, but it probably lacked the scale that we needed it to have. All the experts are telling us we need to build 1.2 million homes in the next 5 years. But, you know, people like the Master Builders Association are actually saying more. They're saying 250,000 homes every year. And we're not going to do that. We're not on target to do that. We struggle to build 170,000 homes a year in this country. So we really do need to find lots of different ways of attacking the problem. One of the things that the crossbench did was, you know, we really pushed the government to enter more into partnerships with industry and with developers, and we're pushing them more to enter into partnerships with the big super funds, which obviously have a huge amount of capital potentially available to commit to housing if we put the settings right for them. So, you know, I think the stuff that the federal government has got across the board has been okay, but it's kind of, for me, it's a C+ in terms of we need to do more, and we need to attack it from every possible angle. In terms of the opposition's housing policy, it's very limited. You know, they're talking about $5 billion in infrastructure for last kilometre infrastructure in the outer suburbs, for the, you know, roads and sewage and lights and things that are required for those. But the reality is that much of that funding is probably in place already at a local government level, and the federal government, the Labor have claimed that it is. But even then, I mean, people who are living in my part of the world don't want to have to move to somewhere that's more than an hour away on the periphery of a city, which lacks green canopy, which lacks aged care, childcare, which lacks the council infrastructure, which is expensive to set up. We know that densification is much more cost effective than building bigger and bigger cities at the periphery, where people don't want to live, and then they're going to have to spend an hour or more coming into the city to work, and a commute that takes them away from their families and makes life that much more challenging, more difficult. Super for housing, I just don't see that it's going to make a significant difference. It's a very small scale, I think, regressive piece of policy. It's a piece of policy that the economists don't like. It's a piece of policy that many Conservative politicians have in the past been critical of, and yet they've rebadged and brought it out again. I think will increase the price of houses in the sort of that first home bracket of 500 to 750,000 ish, because there'll be more competition. And then I don't think that the coalition has adequately costed the impact down the track on people's retirement savings, but also the loss to the government of income from super, of those people who've emptied their super funds out now, and of the increased need for those people potentially to require pension support when they're a bit older. So I don't think that the opposition has well-developed policy. I don't think that the government's policy has enough vision and scope, and I'm really frustrated that neither of them will come to the table and talk about tax reform, which I think really realistically is absolutely key to addressing the housing crisis.
Thanks for those reflections. And I mean, from the perspective of our campaign, we couldn't agree more. Our view on the things that the government has done is that they've been good and they will benefit the people who can directly access them, but they are not necessarily things that are going to make housing more affordable for people en masse. And that's what we really need to be looking at. So absolutely right. We also released a snapshot, actually, a housing snapshot for the electorate of Kooyong last week. And there are 2,800 people in Kooyong who need social housing. So as you say, yes, it's an affluent electorate, but it's also a part of the world where it's really difficult to live on a low income because everything is so expensive. I want to bring Lucas into our next question, and it's about renters and how we can better protect renters. The most common piece of feedback that came to our campaign last year when we ran our People's Commission into Australia's housing crisis was from renters who were forced to move all the time, basically sometimes once a year, because they couldn't afford regular rent increases. What are some of the things you'd like to see changed? And what role could the federal government play in making those things happen? So, for example, the year before last, National Cabinet made an agreement called A Better Deal for Renters, where the federal government agreed with states and territories on some ways that renters could be protected. Is there more that we could be doing, and what are some of the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, thanks, Maiy. Well, you just mentioned Better Deal for Renters. That is a framework that really barely touched on affordability, but it's a framework that has the potential to talk about affordability. So that's something we could look at. Prevention of homelessness, as I said before, is the most effective and cost-effective response that we can have. Like, turn off the tap before it starts. Everybody's Home and Homelessness Australia have both called on the need to increase the Commonwealth rent assistance, which Council of Homeless Persons completely back. We've seen rising costs of living, but we haven't seen Commonwealth rent assistance rise to keep pace with that. Homelessness Australia, in their election platform, which is a great document of some really sensible measures that we could be taking, they're calling for a homelessness prevention transformation fund. So those are all sorts of things that could be sitting there at whether it's at an ongoing level like Commonwealth rent assistance, or something that is coming when you are at a point of a rent emergency, which is definitely something we're seeing a lot more of. I think when you look at kind of big indicators of where we're heading in terms of this crisis, in terms of like the main reasons that are bringing people to homelessness services, last year, people coming specifically because of rental stress jumped 16% in a single year. So that's still sitting at sort of number 5 in the list. And there's another kind of housing descriptor that sits at number 2, and they're sort of spread around there. But that 16% specifically about my rent's gone up to a point I can't pay it should be very alarming. So, you know, we have both of those. Then at a state level, we have programs that are focused on rental protection, like PRAP, the Private Rental Assistance Program, which is essentially, I think, doing a lot of similar work to what Homelessness Australia is calling for, which is, you know, if you're, you lose your job and the rent's due next month and the rent's gone up and you're at that point, you could lose your tenancy, that there's a space there for services coming to support you to hold that for a couple of weeks so you can find that stability, get back on your feet and maintain your housing. So those are all things that we can be doing that have they're very affordable, and they have such powerful ripple-on effects to both protect people and create savings in other places through the system.
Yeah, thanks for that. And Monique, I'm interested in your thoughts on that. You touched on the need for better protection for renters when you spoke a bit earlier, and over 40% of people in Kooyong are renting. What are some of the things you'd like to see changed?
Well, I guess I would like to, I think we should talk about the fact that so many people have insecurity at the end of their 12-month lease, and, you know, in terms of A, being asked to vacate, but B, being faced with excessive rental increase in their rents. But and there's stuff that we can do about that. But I think that we also need to mandate a bit more about energy efficiency, just the conditions that people's rentals are maintained in. We can help landlords with that. We can help them. I think I said earlier, carrot and stick idea. So basically, sort of funding and financing to help landlords upgrade the energy efficiency and conditions of the properties that they own. We do need to make sure, obviously, that the cost of any upgrades doesn't just get passed on to the renters. But then, so that's the carrot, is that there's subsidies or rebates for upgrading facilities and keeping them in a better condition. But then the stick is basically enforcing that and making sure that people do maintain properties in an appropriate way. There should be mandatory disclosures around things like energy efficiency when people go to look at a home, so they understand what they're getting themselves into. And I think I think we should look at things like the limit on rental increases that we've seen in the ACT. So the ACTs are acting on these sorts of issues in lots of different ways, including people with electrification of rental properties and improving the energy efficiency of those properties, while also putting some limits on the extent to which no fault evictions are allowed, or well, basically stopping no fault evictions, but also limiting rent increases. They're all very reasonable things to do, and I think a national approach to these rather than state-based approaches would be better.
I've got a question about tax reform, which is something I'm so pleased that you've mentioned a couple of times now. It's very refreshing to talk to an MP who's interested, not just interested in talking about tax reform, but is actually bringing it up proactively. We heard last year from experts as part of our People's Commission into the housing crisis about the ways that the tax system that we have pushes up house prices. And we heard from people who are on the other side of that they're really angry about that. They may not understand exactly how it works, but they do know that it's stuffing them around and they're angry. Should the federal government take another look at that? I mean, I think you've basically already answered that, but is that something that you're interested in pushing and using your position as a crossbencher to push? There's been a lot of talk about a minority government in the next term. Is this something you're looking at actively pursuing?
I think that tax reform is something that we have to look at as a country for a number of different reasons. Housing's one of them, but it's not the only one, actually. I mean, one of them is just the extent to which we can't keep going as we've been going. So we've got an aging population, fewer people paying income tax. We're increasing our reliance on income tax, which basically comes from wage earners. And we've got all these points in the tax system where people with established wealth are kind of favoured by the tax settings, whereas those people who are in the process of generating and consolidating, I guess, their personal financial status are disadvantaged. So we get too much income we're too reliant on income tax. And then we give all these tax advantages to people who've already established their wealth, essentially. And the problem with that is that the older people are doing much better out of the system than younger people are. And that's why younger people are in the situation now where they can't see how they can afford a home. And, just everyone seems to agree now. There seems to have been a consensus achieved over the last 3 or 4 years that in most cases, 20 and 30-year-olds are not going to be able to afford a home of their own unless they can rely on some form of wealth transfer from their parents or their grandparents, which is just extraordinarily disappointing. It just wasn't like that 20 or 30 years ago. When you go back and look at why that is, it's a problem 3 decades in the making, but it's very clear that about 3 decades ago, we started to see the increase in wages that people were making over time, separating away from the cost of housing. And one of the major contributors to that is our taxation settings. And obviously people always talk about negative gearing, and they talk about the capital gains tax discount, and they have certainly contributed to the current situation. And so, what I think, if you go back, as a doctor in my previous life, we talk about first principles, where you go back to, the first principle is, what are you trying to achieve? Well, what we're trying to achieve should be that all Australians should have a right to adequate housing. And I think most of us agree that Australians, if they really want to work towards owning a home of their own, should have some reasonable prospect of doing that. The reality is that unless we change the tax settings, that's not going to happen. So we have to. And we have to do it in a way that's evidence-based, that's sensitive to all parts of society and to people at all stages of their life and people in all sorts of different economic and financial circumstances. And it's not a question of saying, right, all of this is gone right now, and you can, we don't want to do it in such a way that people are massively disadvantaged. Yeah, there's a reason why politicians get very skittish when you start talking about tax reform, because people always get, of course, it's human nature, get very nervous when we start talking about it. But we can do it in a way that's sensitive and which gives it gets back to that first principle that we can again approach a situation where Australians have certainty about their ability to access adequate and ideally affordable housing as well. So yeah, so we have to have tax reform. We just have to. And I and other members of the crossbench are very clear about that. The way things go in politics is that people either shy away from it or they get on the front foot and they start attacking you. And, you know, even just as a result of this call, I'm going to have the media calling up and saying, will she rule out this? Will she rule out that? What's she going to do out this? What about GST? Blah, blah, blah. And the reality is, you know, that's just a silly short-termism that really doesn't help anybody in the long term. It doesn't help us make Australia a better place. It doesn't help people who are trying to afford a home of their own. We need to do it. And I don't think we're going to get it in the short term unless there is a hung parliament and the crossbench has the balance of power, because as so far, and I'd be so happy to be proved wrong about this, but so far the major parties have not indicated going into a federal election campaign that they have any appetite or courage to take on this issue. And so it seems clear that unless there's a hung parliament and people like me are involved in that parliament, we won't get the tax reform that the country needs.
Once again, music to my ears. We will. I do have a question that I think we'll end on, but I'll plant it in both yours and Lucas's heads now about what our campaign needs to do to help build some of the appetite in the community for these changes. Before we do that, I want to get into some of the questions that we're seeing come through the Q&A. We've got a number of questions actually touching on this issue of empty homes. A couple of people have popped in some statistics and numbers about the number of empty homes and empty apartments in Kooyong. And a couple of people are asking, what are some of the ways that we can make those homes available to people who need them?
Yeah, it's a tough one, actually. It's interesting. So the state government has taken this on to a certain extent. I mean, one of the things, it's really interesting, actually, how hard it is to prove that a house is empty. I mean, when I go door knocking, you see lots of homes where there's, you know, the grass has overgrown, and there's lots of mail in the mailbox. It's never been picked up, and it's clear that the houses are empty. And lots of people who live next door to one of those sorts of places, you know, are driven mad by it, because it's not great to have an empty home next door. But it can be difficult for the local governments and the state government to prove it. So they look at things like water usage and things like that, but it's not always easy. And there are some people who basically take steps to sort of disguise the fact that the homes are empty, and they're doing it for various reasons. The state government has increased the land tax on those empty properties, and it's ramping it up, so it's becoming really very significant for if the properties are empty for 2 years or more. But I think they're having difficulty identifying the empty places in some instances, and in sort of forcing the issue. They probably need to get a bit more on the front foot about that, because land banking is a real problem. And but the fact that we have empty houses which are ready to inhabit is a real problem. It's not really something I think that the federal government is in a position to take on. Both of the major parties have talked about foreign ownership and limiting housing purchases from foreign investors who are unlikely to inhabit the homes. But the number of houses that we're talking about are very small. It's about 6,000 houses last year. That's not going to make a big difference. There are other sorts of things we can. One of the issues is speeding up approvals and things like that. So often if people vacate their home because they're doing a reno, it can take longer than they expect to get permission and planning, and then find the tradies and things like that they need for the renovation. And so homes can end up being empty for 12 months or more while they're renting, you know, using effectively two homes, because their home property is empty, but they're having to rent it as well. There's a number, it's actually quite a difficult problem. Some people say we should do something about holiday houses. I don't know that would make a big difference. Many, A, people have a right to have a holiday house, but also B, people don't want to live where the holiday houses are, because that's not where the jobs are. So I'm not sure that would make a big difference. It's not an easy problem, the ones, but one of the issues I think is there's a real disincentive for many older people to downsizing because of things like stamp duty, and people are scared about impact on their super and the pension potentially, and the impact on their savings and what they're going to ability to pass them on to their kids. We need to remove that disincentive to downsizing, because I think in this part of the world there's a few people living in houses with lots of empty bedrooms that we could use. We could use better if we could get families with 3 or 4 kids into those homes. But I think it's something we need to think about, so that people aren't disadvantaged by downsizing to the extent that they currently are.
One thing I'll pop into your head, and this isn't the only way to solve the issue of the empty houses, but I do think there's some low-hanging fruit around tax reform. State governments can impose all of the vacancy taxes and levies they want, but at the end of the day, if it's possible to negatively gear and get a CGT discount on homes that are on short stay rental sites, people are always going to do that. It's always going to be attractive in certain areas. Our campaign interacts with a lot of kind of high value people living in high value areas where it's really lucrative to put homes on Airbnb, and because they're entitled to all the same goodies as if you are listed as a real rental, all of the incentives are there. I've got a question.
Sorry, Maiy, can I just interrupt? I would love to hear a bit more about that and the information about that.
And there's all sorts of stuff people can deduct, artwork, or all sorts of things that you can deduct as part of your negative gearing expenses when you're renting out on Airbnb or stays. Anyway, I have a question here. Kooyong has some of the highest housing costs in Australia, pricing out young people, renters and essential workers. Given that many residents opposed increased density, which you've mentioned a few times, Monique, and social housing, which you talked about, Lucas, in their suburbs, how do you plan to advocate for genuinely affordable housing while balancing local opposition to necessary developments? I might start with you, Mon, and I'll see Lucas, if you've got anything to add.
So it's so interesting. There's a site in Kooyong on a major road, and it's currently owned by the Victorian State Government, by Vic Roads. It used to be a Vic Roads building. It's a massive, big site on a major road near Kew Junction. So it's near a shopping centre with good access to public transport and quite close to the city. And the Victorian State Government wants to sell it off. They're not using that site anymore. So I held a community meeting about 4 or 5 months ago for people from the area, just to talk about it, because my thought was this is a fantastic spot for social and affordable housing. It's ideal. And so I wanted to hear what people from the community thought about, and we had a lovely meeting with about 50, 60 people came along on a Thursday night, and at the end of it I sort of polled them all about their thoughts, and 98% of them, so it must have been one person out of 50 or 60, was not in favour. People were absolutely aware of the fact that we need more social affordable housing. They agreed that it was a great spot for it to go. Their major concern was, could we avoid pulling down the buildings and could we repurpose them? They're these big sort of existing, actually quite cool sort of 60s Vic Roads buildings. And they sort of said it would be so much better if we didn't, have to start again. Could we repurpose them and, whatever. But so I don't think the issue is not that people in this part of the world are all NIMBYs, and, the Premier likes to say we're all NIMBYs and we're completely opposed to it and blah, blah, blah. It's actually not true. In fact, many of us want our kids, want to know that our kids and our grandkids aren't going to go and live to it's not just personal interest, but we don't want our kids to be forced to go away. And we do understand that we need to densify. The concern is that the state government has gone about it, I think, in a way which is arse end up, and they have not consulted. They have not got any the sort of appropriate detail in the plans that they've put in front of the community. They haven't given the community the appropriate confidence, I guess, that they're thinking about things like drainage, infrastructure, primary schools, secondary schools, childcare, aged care, green spaces, preservation of tree canopy, and consideration of things like heritage overlays. And a very large part of a third of the areas just around here that have been slated for increased development have heritage overlay. And the state government has not been, they've been a little bit, they've been a bit evasive about how that's going to play out. They've also been really poor in that their language and what they've announced has been really unclear. So people are getting freaked out because they think there's going to be a 20-story tower next door. And then they said, oh, no, it'll only be 12 stories in the very centre of the areas, and then 6 stories and 3 to 4. But they keep changing that as well. I mean, if people don't understand what's going to happen and they don't understand the potential impact in the area that they live, and they've made an investment there, and they've got an emotional investment in the area that they live and things like that, of course they're going to get freaked out and be opposed to it. And so I think we do need social and affordable housing. We need the Victorian State Government to commit to developing sites like the Vic Road site and Denmark Street Q, which they have not indicated that they will put any social affordable housing on. And we are saying we want our kindergarten teachers and nurses and police people and people to be able to live in the communities where they work. We want the state government to do that, but they haven't committed that they'll do that. And we want them to talk to us, and we want them to involve residents in decision making. It's not NIMBYism, and it's really frustrating that we get to this sort of name calling and stereotyping, because I think it really removes the ability to have respectful and positive and constructive conversations about these things.
Can I just add to that, Maiy? I just wanted to speak specifically about the young people element of that question that was asked, because I think that's a really important component of a homelessness response. That, yes, we need more social housing, but we also need more specific youth-focused social housing. It's a gigantic issue. Last year, 16,000 young people, 15 to 24, came to homelessness services needing assistance. 11,000 of those were coming on their own, right? But our system isn't really built for young people. It's built for adults, and it's based on assumptions of kind of adult circumstances. So, there's the basic level of, put a young person into social housing. They need different kind of supports than an adult will. They're still learning life skills, housing, all of the business of running a housing. But more profoundly important is the fact that social housing works by the rent being a percentage of your income. And so young people are coming on lower income supports than adults, which means often they struggle to get into broad general social housing. So we need those specific youth accommodation developments to ensure that we're getting in quickly and giving young people supports. Because the thing we also know is that if someone experiences prolonged youth homelessness, often they will tend to re-experience homelessness throughout their life. So obviously it's a really key period in someone's life, and it's so important we intervene quickly and give them stability so that they can go about, just living their life and having the opportunities that all of us were fortunate enough to have.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lucas. That's a really a good point. And I think one of the things that can get lost when we talk about social housing in a more generic way. We are a few minutes over, but I do want to ask one more question. I should say we've gotten so many questions that we haven't gotten to, and I'm really sorry about that. We have questions about the need for better regulation for real estate agents, questions about MPs owning investment properties, questions about the minister's comments about not wanting house prices to go down. We've seen all of them, but we only have 45 minutes today and we've already gone over. But there is just one more question that I wanted to put to both of you. I might start with Lucas and then end with Monique, about what our campaign needs to do to build support for some of these things that we're talking about, because our campaign is calling for tax reform is one side of it, and then a really major investment in social housing being the other side of the coin. And these are big changes. We often get told that they're not politically possible. What are the things that our campaign needs to do from your perspective to make them politically possible?
Look, I think the campaign does amazing work. It's a circle, right? Because you'll occasionally hear politicians or commentators come out and say it's too hard, it's too big to solve. And so people reduce their expectations. So they're not putting pressure on parties to go, we want the answers, we want you to do the hard work, so they don't have to. I think it really is about that awareness and connecting all of us together, awareness around that first piece, like I said, we can fix this. It has been fixed overseas. Like, it's possible to do, but it's about us kind of not throwing it in the too hard basket and rolling up the sleeves and asking the question, what kind of society do we want to be? Like, doing work to become that society, which I would think if you ask most people, they would say, we want to be a society where everyone can live in a safe, secure, and dignified home. So it's about connecting that sort of stuff so that you don't get distracted and disheartened by the kind of distractions and all kinds of weird things that get thrown out about it. You know, immigration's the problem and this is the problem. The problem is we have to do structural work to fix things. And it's the stuff that, coming back to one of the first questions you were asking about housing policy, so much of the housing policy is about focusing on demand rather than housing policies that are focusing on supply and how do we build supply. And we know that's a hard thing at the moment. We've got, you know, blockages in supply because of, you know, lack of workers, lack of materials. It's a difficult puzzle to solve, but that's all the more reason why we need our governments to be getting there and facilitating those conversations to solve it. So I think it's just about us staying connected and telling those stories, and also telling those stories by giving the microphone to the people who are experiencing that. We had the People's Commission last year, a great example of that, where you could hear directly from these people who are experiencing these housing stress, experiencing homelessness. Incredible people, resilient people, but also people like you and me and your dad and your sister and your daughter. These are just people like you, and lives are on the line. So we just have to do the hard work.
Very, very well said, very eloquently said. And Monique, I'll come to you now. What do you need from us as a campaign to build support for some of these big things that you've been talking about today?
I guess I think people need to understand. I agree with Lucas completely. You know, taking it back to what are the things that matter for us as a society, and that is that people should have access to adequate housing. And I think that I do think that for Australians, it's important that we've got that young people can aspire to own their own home in their lifetime. I think that remains something that's very important to people. And so what do we need to do that? Well, we need to work together. People need to understand that their voices matter and that they will be heard. And, you know, if organisations like your own get together and create that critical impetus, you will be heard. I think politicians know that there's a growing frustration in the country around this issue. And I think actually heart of hearts, the political parties know that they really do have to do something about this, or they're going to run into trouble with their own electorates. But they have to be told that again and again, because they tend to be a bit deaf-eared, and they really respond to pressure. So you guys, everyone involved in the from whatever angle and whichever part of the housing sort of system, movement, whatever you want to call it, you need to work together, but you need to get people putting pressure on their politicians, because politicians are very much motivated by hearing from the people who support them, who put them in place, that what they care about. So you have to be a lot vocal, and you have to get in front of people, and you have to keep the pressure up, but you will be heard if you do that.
Thank you so much. We actually heard a similar thing from Jerome last week.
Yeah.
Keep it up even when it's annoying.
Beyond annoying, you have to go on and on. So you're blue in the face, and you think, I'm so sick of talking about this. I really want to, but you have to keep going. And that's something I've learned in the last 3 years. You only get results when you do it till you are absolutely sick of saying the same thing again and again and again.
Thank you so much. I want to thank you both so much for your time, and thank you to everybody who joined us today. We had nearly 60 people join us. A few people have fallen off, and I want to thank everyone who submitted a question. I'm so sorry that there were so many questions we didn't get to. And we're looking forward to our next town hall, which is on Thursday, with Stephen Bates from the electorate of Brisbane. I think there are a few people who are registering for a few of these, but actually most of the participants have been local, which is really good to see. So thank you so much again, Monique and Lucas, and thank you to everyone who joined us today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoons.
Thanks so much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye now.